welcome to part 24 on the Lackawanna Cutoff, where I'm going to be competing with number 26. We're going to be talking, seriously though, we're going to be talking to Pat McKnight, who is the archivist and historian here at Steamtown. Hi, I'm Chuck Walsh, and I'm president of the North Jersey Rail Commuter Association. And we're going to be moving to a different part of Steamtown to do the interview with Pat, but this is the part of Steamtown most people who are familiar with Steamtown would recognize. You can see over here, well, the steam locomotive is going over to the station with its train. There's the turntable area, the big boy, and the rest of the museum behind the big boy. The trolley museum, which is also here. Delaware Lackawanna operates through here with freights. See Bridge 60 in the distance. And so let's move over to the administrative building and go see Pat McKnight and have him talk to us about not only the records for the Lackawanna, but also records for other railroads here that are also being kept at Steamtown. Why don't you be getting a tour of the archives here at Steamtown, and I hope you look forward to this. This is an unusual opportunity that we have here. And in fact, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the administrative offices. What you see over here is actually the Steamtown, that those of you familiar with Steamtown, that most of you would see. This is kind of behind the scenes, and we'll be able to take a look at some things that most people don't usually get a chance to look at. So why don't you join me and we'll come on and meet with Pat. Okay, we're here in the office storage building of Steamtown, the library, which stores books, obviously, and we'll talk to Pat McKnight about all the things that are contained in this building. But I want to, first of all, welcome and thank Pat for being willing to be interviewed and to talk about his role and all of the different records and photographs, many of which we've been able to use in our past videos. Pat, once again, thank you for allowing us to subject you to this. Maybe you want to start with a little bit of your background and work us into how you came to be the historian archivist here at Steamtown.
Well, Steamtown National Historic Site is a unit of the National Park Service, and I've been an employee of the National Park Service for the last 35 years. Pretty much got my start many years ago at Rocky Mountain National Park. I was hired to be a volunteer research historian. I did a paper on the water rights of Rocky Mountain National Park. A dam had recently broken and a couple people were killed, and the Park Service needed to have it documented why they had water rights in the middle of the national park, in the middle of what they thought was a wilderness area. From there I went to Death Valley, where I was a museum aide. From Death Valley I went to DeSoto National Memorial as a seasonal interpreter, where I even wore a suit of armor once upon a time. I actually had to dress up like a conquistador, shoot matchlock muskets and crossbows.
What state is that in?
That's in Florida,
Florida, okay.
so just outside of Tampa Bay. From there, I went to Manhattan sites in New York City. I worked at Castle Clinton and Federal Hall, so I can say I actually worked on Wall Street once upon a time. From there, I went back to Death Valley for a couple years, where I settled down more as a museum technician, curator type. From there, I went to the Alaska Regional Office, where I worked for 3 years.
Now, in terms of climate, you couldn't really come up with two more disparate places to be in terms of. Presumably, you have stories about how hot it could get in Death Valley.
Yes, in Death Valley, often 110s, 120s. I went for like 6 months without seeing a cloud, so that could get pretty dry out there. And then again, Alaska could get really cold too.
Okay.
Although you throw in the humidity of Florida, and there's another major variation in there.
Okay.
Especially if you're wearing a suit of armor and chainmail.
So from there, what was your next stop?
From the Alaska region, I went to the Washington office of the National Park Service. I worked in the Curatorial Services Division of Cultural Resources in the Washington office, where I helped come up with policies and procedures for all the parks in the National Park Service.
And from there?
And from there, I got a historian position at Steamtown National Historic Site. Even though I had been a number of different positions in the Park Service, whether it was just a simple park ranger or a museum aide, a museum technician, a curator, my master's degree was always in history, and that's where I kind of wanted to go with it.
So, and what year was that you came to Steamtown?
Came to Steamtown around 2000.
2000. Okay. So the park had been in operation for what, 13, 14 years roughly?
Yeah, the park was created in 1986. They had their grand opening with the visitor use facilities that they have now in 1995. So they'd been running, full steam for about 5 years before I got here.
Okay. And for those who are not familiar with the history, Steamtown originally came down from Bellows Falls, Vermont, and had been operating there for a number of years, and was operated as a Steamtown Foundation, if memory serves, before it became part of the National Park Service.
Yeah,
for a couple of years.
It was a private railroad museum that belonged to a gentleman named Nelson Blount. He made his money during the World War II selling basically fish to the military, providing food. That's how he made his fortune, and he had hobbies on the side, and one of them, which seemed to grow and grow, was his own railroad collection. Now, unlike some people, he didn't do model trains, he did the full standard gauge size trains.
Uh-huh. So that means that that the collection that is here, and we're not really going to focus on the locomotives and the operation of what most people see, I guess, when they come to Steamtown. We're not going to focus on that, but obviously it is part of the entire operation. But your focus, though, here in this building, maybe you can tell us what it is that you do, what you're responsible for, and also, I guess we're going to also get into the Lackawanna. We call it the Lackawanna collection, but there's more to your record repository than your. But I don't know if you call it archives, repository, or all of that collectively is presumably under your responsibility, or how does that work?
Well, it's going more into the history of Steamtown. Like I said, Nelson Blount had his own railroad collection, but he also wanted more stuff. And one of the things that he did was, in order to get donations, he needed to have a not-for-profit organization set up. And that's when Nelson Blount created the Steamtown Foundation for the Preservation of Steam, and all these other things. It was a very long title. But he created this organization it had to have a board of trustees, which was a very good thing for him, because he died shortly thereafter in a plane crash. So this organization called Steamtown USA had his collection and basically had a site in Vermont. From there, they sort of ran tourist excursions from the 60s when he died up till the 80s. And in the 80s, they made a decision to try and move to Scranton, where they thought they'd have more recognition, more people coming out, since it wasn't in the middle of Vermont, and they were hoping to have more money. And the city of Scranton made promises to bring them out here. They came out here around 1984 and subsequently went bankrupt. And then the local politicians were trying to figure out a way to bail out Steamtown USA. And they approached the National Park Service, which oversees a lot of preservation grants. And at that time, our director of the Park Service was a rail fan. And he thought that it was a great idea to create a National Park Service focused on the history of steam. So he was able to push it through. He had a local congressman named Joe McDade where he got support, and ultimately they arranged to have the Park Service take over this yard, take over the collection of Steamtown USA, and do a historic site focused on the history and the impact of steam on America.
And they also had, which was also very convenient and nice as well, was they had access to a railroad main line, which was at that point not, well, there was, I guess, limited operations on it, but it was not a main line that was a busy main line, let's put it like that. Which, I would think for a steam operation, is unusual, actually. So and also in a mountain, so you get the chug up the hill, that type of thing. So there's some really nice aspects to having it at Scranton.
Yeah, there were some nice aspects. The National Park Service unit was created. They looked at all the different opportunities, whether they wanted to own the right-of-way or whether they were going to share it with the local rail authority. And ultimately, we just got consolidated into our 60-acre site here. And it's been run ever since. 1986 is when the park was created, and ever since we've been a unit of the National Park Service, with all the responsibilities that go along with it. And that includes how we take care of our historic structures, how we take care of our historic artifacts, libraries, and archives.
So, when we, at some point, I'm wondering what is the chronology in terms of, and some of this would be, of course, before you came to Steamtown, but what was the chronology of the different types of, I'll say, things that were not exactly rolling stock or locomotives? I'm thinking more of records and photographs. But maybe we can start with the Syracuse collection. When does that come in from the Lackawanna?
Well,
originally from the Lackawanna.
Well, the records of Steamtown came from a number of different places. Steamtown USA had some archival collections because they were dedicated to the history and the impact of steam as well, although they almost looked at it on a national level. So they did collect a number of archival collections, Steamtown USA, and they brought them here from Vermont. Included in that is stuff from the Nathan Manufacturing Collection. Nathan Company made accoutrements for steam locomotives. They made they didn't make bells, they made whistles, they made lubricators, injectors, all these different devices you needed to run a steam locomotive with. They actually got some of the archives from the Nathan Company. They also had quite a large collection from the Lehigh Valley Railroad, and they had brought that down with them as well. So even before this park was created, Steamtown USA had the Nathan Collection and the Lehigh Valley. Now, when everything moved down to Scranton and the Park Service took over the site, we actually found paper and documentation in some of the buildings here. On top of that, there was an additional DL&W and Erie Railroad collection of records that had been squirreled away in the old passenger station, which is now the Radisson Hotel. So ultimately, the records that were in that building, and the passenger station was basically a large office building. So they had a lot of records dealing with both the DL&W and the Erie. So we had, from that area, we had a lot of DL&W Erie stuff to go along with the Lehigh Valley and the Nathan collection. So when I got here, we had literally 1,000 boxes of archives waiting to be processed. And when I got here around 2000, there was a looking at an approach on how we were going to deal with the archives here. They had a reboxing project where they basically took all these archives and put them in nice, pretty, acid-free boxes, numbered them 1 to 1,000, and said, we've done our job. We've processed the archives. They're preserved. They're in a dark, secure room. That might be good for some people, but it wasn't good enough for what we needed to do here. And when I got here, we started actually processing the archives, started to get them organized, tried to put them in a better environment so they wouldn't deteriorate as fast, and basically figure out what the heck we had. So that required a lot of work. And we processed the collection, got it organized, and as we got it organized, people started asking questions. And we did one of the worst things we could have possibly done. We had answers to some of those questions. And it renewed additional interest. And one thing led to another. We had files for the DL&W Railroad, but not a lot on the built environment. After a while, we were approached by a group from New Jersey that had collected the chief engineer files of the DL&W from Hoboken. And those records, at first when they approached the park, we thought that they were just looking for pointers on how to deal with their collection. Next thing we knew, they were offering the entire collection to us, which almost doubled the size of our collection. The chief engineer's office wasn't the choo-choo train engineer. He was the engineer that oversaw building and the built environment. And we got literally hundreds of boxes of records, as well as over 50,000 large format drawings. And that, basically increased the workload here. And as we moved along processing that collection, scanning in the drawings, organizing the records, we got approached by Syracuse University. And Syracuse University had the corporate records of the DL&W and the Erie Railroad that they had gotten in the 1960s, right after the merger of those two railroads. And they sort of came out of the blue and offered them to us as well. I guess Syracuse University was consolidating some of their storage, and when they acquired those railroad records, they had professors that were really interested in those railroads. By the 2000s, the people that had been there in the 60s were no longer there, and the interest to keep those records really weren't there. And part of those records was a massive glass plate negative collection. Over 20,000 glass plate negatives from the DL&W were part of that. And we had been asking if we could help them scan them to make them more accessible, and they offered them as part of the whole deal. So we got 3 large semi-trucks full of archives from Syracuse. And that's been keeping me busy since then.
So the so-called Syracuse collection is more than photographs, although certainly that is a focal point, because as they say, is a picture's worth 1,000 words, and there's so much that's contained in there. Now those the photographs specifically were done in several series, as they've been called, A, B, C, and so forth, F, X, and so forth. There were a couple different photographers that the Lackawanna used from, I don't know exactly when they started. I think 1932-ish is when I've seen the last of the photographs taken, at least, I don't know if they were on glass plates or not, but by that time. But what time span are we roughly talking about?
We're talking roughly the very early 1900s, so like 1902, 1903 to the 1930s, early 1930s. The railroad did either hire contract photographers or had employees take pictures that were employees of the railroad, but they were basically considered corporate records of the DL&W. It wasn't like a separate photographer taking his own little set of pictures and donating, and it become the John Smith photograph collection. These are the basically corporate records. We have a general idea who the photographer was, although I can't swear absolutely that all of these photographs were taken by one person or another. We have a basic idea who they're probably attributed to. But there was Bunnell, his assistant Anneman, and they worked out of the Scranton area, and then there was another person named Barry. And between those three, they generated close to 30,000 negatives that we now are trying to manage and make accessible as we possibly can.
Now, presumably any kind of development of photographs takes a certain degree of expertise. In those days, glass negatives were, I don't know how much you can speak to this specifically, but presumably you needed a certain degree of special knowledge in order to do that, to handle those kind of things.
At that time, they had to have a professional photographer. It's not like we have nowadays where it's just point and shoot. So it did require knowledge of the settings on the camera and everything else, and it was quite a clunky setup. It was basically a box camera. Most of those images that we have are 8x10 images, and that meant the back of the camera had to be 8x10 or bigger. We have them up to 11x17 or 8x22 inches for the panoramic shots. So it took quite a bit of knowledge to figure out how to take a good picture.
The good news, at least for those negatives which are still in good shape, and I know that some of them are not, or they're varying degrees of degradation that have occurred over, in some cases, over 100 years. But for those that are in pretty good shape, I think you would agree that there's exquisite detail in terms of how clear the photographs are. That was perhaps one of the advantages, that you could scan these things. And of course, I know you maybe want to talk about some of the scanning process, because if you were to go to the maximum number of megapixels and so forth, it could be enormous amounts of data that would be required to store these in the highest resolution.
Yeah, it just blows the mind how, where you have to do the cut line on them. Basically, most of these are scanned in roughly at 300 dots per inch, 300 dpi in a JPEG format. We do have the opportunity, if we need to rescan them at a higher level, to do that. Now, 300 dpi may not sound very much to somebody that scans in, let's say, color slides, but it is quite a bit of detail for an 8x10 photograph. And most of our requests for photographs for publications, that has satisfied most of them. There's a few people that have asked for more. There are some people that have been told that magically, if you scan them in a TIFF format at 24,000 dpi, that it's going to show everything in the world. And all I found is it takes almost a half hour to scan and even longer to try and print, and the resolution of this screens and the printers don't match the resolution you can scan stuff in. So, we basically have the images. You might want to call it a giant thumbnail. Even at 300 dpi, the file size is, well over a meg, usually 2 megabytes is the average size of one of our glass plate negatives. So we're talking a lot of information. If you're talking about scanning everything at a super high resolution, we just don't have the time. Although, again, like I said, for specific publications, we can rescan them.
Now, staying on the topic of the photographs, because with the New Jersey cutoff, presumably it was Mr. Bunnell or Bunnell, I don't know, I've heard it pronounced both ways,
Yeah.
Would come over and take photographs, and we now have access to those, but it seems as if he didn't take as many photographs as when we'll call it the Clark Summit Halstead cutoff was done. That there's several orders of magnitude more photos that were taken of that than there were of the New Jersey cutoff. But it seems like there was a focus sometimes on construction, but also there were other purposes for the photographs. Were there not like legal reasons, or what other purposes might the photographs have served?
I mean, the same thing they serve nowadays. One is to document what they did, look at the contractors and the amount of work and the type of work they did. And we do that every day, even with the Park Service. We have people painting and doing some track work, and I'm constantly photographing the work they do because, again, a picture tells, a picture's worth 1,000 words. Other things is railroad accidents. We have quite a collection. Besides the construction photos, there are accident photos that show different things. And,
Like a train hits car, or train hits, maybe even people, but I don't know if they don't. I haven't seen any bodies.
They usually don't show bodies. They show the result of the accident. Well, yeah, train hit train. Train hits platform. Ferry hits platform. Ferry hits other ferry. We have a number of accident photos there. And, I'd never realized in railroad history how predominant lawyers were. You think nowadays they have ambulance chasing lawyers. Well, back then they had the very, very same thing, and they had their own set of lawyers protecting the railroads from charges against them. So yeah, using photos to document the accidents were just like they do now.
Yeah, because I was looking through some of the records, talking about the engineering records for the Clark Summit Halstead cutoff, and unfortunately I don't know that those equivalent records exist for the New Jersey cutoff, or at least you don't have them here.
Yeah, we definitely don't have them here. What's interesting is, we do not have, while we have a very, very good representation of the DL&W Railroad for what they generated, we have general superintendent records, we have chief engineer records, and we have over 5,000 personnel records, but some things we don't have. Focus, construction correspondence dealing with the New Jersey cutoff, we do not seem to have. We have minor pockets of records, but nothing major.
There's speculation as to where, if they do exist, that whether Lincoln Bush possibly took them with him. That I don't know.
Well, what the Tri-State Railway Historical Society, the group in New Jersey that donated the chief engineer records to us, basically gave everything that they found lock, stock, and barrel, but there's a good possibility things were missed. One thing that we do have that tells a little bit about the New Jersey cutoff is that the photographs are included with the photo collection, but also our large format drawing collection does have some of the facilities that were built. So, the actual construction correspondence seems to be missing right now. Other documentation, financial records in the corporate archives from the DL&W that we got from Syracuse. Again, the images that we got from Syracuse. There's some minor mentions in some of the other pockets, but definitely there's things missing. Similar inquiries I get. People want to know about what locomotives the DL&W had. And we really don't have a very strong record of the locomotives of the DL&W. Whatever the person's position that oversaw motive power. We don't have much on that, and we don't have a lot on the passenger cars.
Now, Tabor, in his book, who we just recently interviewed, Thomas Tabor III, in his book, does record, at least I'll say at a high level, information about the individual cars and locomotives. Perhaps people are looking for more detail than something that was put into Tabor's book, but I guess what it comes down to is that there's a certain degree of, let's say, good or bad fortune in terms of the preservation of records, because there must have to figure that the railroad had records stored in many different places, Hoboken being one of them, and I've heard stories about that not everything was preserved or was gotten in time. So it's quite possible that records that might have been possibly could have been preserved couldn't be, because I've heard stories because it couldn't fit any more than to the truck or whatever. Just ran out, whatever. They ran out of time, they ran out of space and that kind of thing. And it's only at this end when we start looking back and say, oh, I wish we had this, wish we had that. And we don't know where it was at the time when it was available.
Yeah, it's hard to say. When the passenger station in Scranton was being remodeled, that's when a lot of the records were salvaged. A lot of stuff made it out into other individuals' cars, vehicles, whatever you want to say. We have a lot of the records, we have footprints on them because they were just spread all over the place willy-nilly. And periodically we get somebody that has a piece of the collection. Some of the general superintendent's files, some of the personnel files that were part of what was collected there, they pop up. And people often offer them. Usually, I wish they offered them straight out as opposed to saying, oh, we'll sell these to you.
Yeah.
And we're not in the business of buying up railroad records.
Well,
we have enough to keep us busy with anyhow.
Well, the thing is, and with anything, there's always going to be private individuals who have something other, may have photos, they may have records, and they end up in somebody's attic, and may or may not be, they may or may not be donated here. They could be donated somewhere else, or they could be thrown away. And it's one of those things. It's so you probably at this point, even though you may still be at some point requiring more, we're probably getting towards the end of where whatever you're going to get, you probably already have at this point.
At the level of records that we would like to have. Again, the chief engineer files, there's a definite filing system that they used. But when you start getting bits and pieces of them, and you don't really know the provenance or how they were organized, that's when it gets to be a little bit confusing. And a lot of the stuff people want to donate now are just little bits and pieces that aren't tied together. So it does make it a little difficult to integrate it into what our existing archives are.
Now, another question I have for you, and this has to do with the president's correspondence. I've looked through, not all yet, but getting towards the end of covering all of President Truesdale's correspondence from 1899 to
1916 or something.
Yeah, somewhere around the First World War. And then there's no correspondence from the president, whoever he might be, from there on in, anywhere. Do we know that they just stopped? They didn't stop corresponding, but the question, I'm wondering if we know what exactly happened in 1916 and why the records no longer exist.
I honestly don't know. That's just when they go from and to, and right now we have a focus on Truesdale's outgoing correspondence, where I'm actually trying to have remote transcribers transcribe what he wrote. And when you have everything transcribed, you can do a word search across all those records, which just makes it really interesting on what you can find. But why they stopped doing it, I don't know. I think it may have just been overkill for a while. It's hard to say. And that's what, when they donated, when the Erie Lackawanna, after the merger of the DL and W, the Erie, that's what they had. And that's what they gave to Syracuse as part of their corporate archives. It's hard to say why they stopped. I'm thinking perhaps they didn't want to be or need to be as meticulous. Because one thing from 1899 to 1916, most people will recognize that's when the DL and W did most of its growth. After World War I hit, it kind of flattened out. They still had certain projects. They did the electrification project in New Jersey, a few other improvements and straightening, but the major projects of the DL and W were pretty much done by World War I.
Right, including both cutoffs, both in New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Now, the presidential files actually exist before 1899. They're not typewritten, however.
They're handwritten, and it's like reading a foreign language. It takes a little bit of skill, and it's also like a third or fourth generation carbon type copy. So it is very difficult to read, and we have tried to do some reading on that as well, but for the skill level of most of my transcribers, just transcribing a typewritten page is hard enough.
And based on my own experience, the quality of the copy varies greatly from the blue type being very easy to read to almost so faint that it's almost indecipherable. So, and anywhere in between. So it could be quite a challenge, and even trying to have, let's say, what was a character recognition type of software would probably have a difficult time with much of that.
Yeah, I've had people approach me and say, "Oh, OCR is the solution to every problem in the world." It's not with the different typefaces that exist. The some paper browns over the years, and it's very difficult to run that OCR software. I've had some people say that if they did it, they could figure out a way, but I have not seen application where it goes across the faint type to the hard type to everything else.
Because I've picked up out of the presidential correspondence a number of tidbits about Truesdale in general, but specifically having to do with the New Jersey cutoff. But it is an enticing thought to think that maybe that those engineering records which exist for the Pennsylvania cutoff somewhere perhaps exist for the New Jersey cutoff, because there's some really interesting stuff that is discussed for the Pennsylvania cutoff, and correspondence even going back and forth to President Truesdale, but internally and at different levels, and discussing various proposals and all that kind of stuff that would be fascinating to see if it would exist. But once again, maybe I'll be doing some digging around and see if there's any possibility whether the Bush family still has some of that. But it's all it's speculative at this point.
There may be puzzle pieces hidden away in the corporate archives, which I haven't gotten processed as greatly as the chief engineer files and the superintendent's files of the DL and W Railroad. Not that we have any large collection of records, but there could still be little puzzle pieces hidden away in these different areas that, we're talking millions of documents, piecing these from different areas and maybe getting a little bit better puzzle recognition. Not saying that it's absolutely perfect, because one other thing about the records that we got from Syracuse is we not only got the DL and W and some stuff from the Erie, but we had all of their subsidiary railroads, and we have records for them as well. So you never know how that stuff ties in and gets together.
And the subsidiaries were at one time operated almost as if they were separate railroads, even if they were part of the Lackawanna technically, or the Erie technically.
Yeah, like the Morris and Essex. And then again, there's some railroads in there that just existed on paper, pretty much. They didn't have their own rolling stock. They just, they were more of a paper railroad, but ultimately they were tied together.
Well, the Lackawanna Railroad of New Jersey, which was de facto the New Jersey cutoff, was a paper railroad. It didn't exactly, it was a real railroad, but corporate-wise, it was indistinguishable from the Lackawanna Railroad. It's just that because, I guess, legally because of stock and so forth that they had issued to pay for the $11 million in construction, that they took 30 years to pay off the bonds or the stock, and then when that was in 1941, that would have been, then they basically dissolved that. But I don't know if that's an example of a paper railroad, but it's
Well, but we do have that additional information. So there is still a lot of information we need to go through or can go through, although it's a marathon. It's not a sprint. You just don't run 5 minutes and get to the finish line and call yourself done. You just have to slog through the records and then figure out where the other stuff is and see where all the puzzle pieces are and see what you can actually put together. That's what makes the history interesting.
So in terms of trying to, in a sense, organize everything, has there been sort of a priority list? Or, obviously you've gone through the photographs. And I know you're still soliciting feedback, so that, because in some cases the photographs, in many cases, they're not identified, they're not even dated, and it's I know you, even on Erie Lackawanna, folks are given photographs every morning, and there's commentary there to see if people recognize a location or maybe more detail and such. Usually with success, but not always. Scenes change in 100 years. You may not be able to recognize a location, from 1910, right? In this year, 2019.
Yeah. There's just a lot of information there. Now, when Syracuse University did have the corporate records, they did do some basic organization, and we've kept that organizational framework when we processed it into the NPS system. We are still trying to identify areas that can be better documented, usually looking at the idea that it deals with an area that's going to be of interest, like transcribing Truesdale's outgoing correspondence, as opposed to trying to transcribe something else.
Okay.
So if we do identify something, we'll hopefully try and get it processed. Right now we are going through a process of scanning the entire general superintendent's files and the chief engineer files, scanning them into a PDF format, and hopefully someday we'll get them mounted on an internet site. And I've been trying to do it with NP Gallery, which is a digital library the Park Service maintains. But we're constantly trying to get additional stuff added and just expand it as much as we can. But the chief engineer files, the general superintendent's files, the glass plate negatives, the Truesdale correspondence are all major sections of this puzzle we call the DL and W Railroad.
Now, the chief engineer would have been, as you mentioned previously, would have been involved with construction, building, or maybe maintenance of the railroad.
Yeah, maintenance away.
The general superintendent, what was his job?
His job seemed to be overseeing overseeing the day-to-day railroad operations and combining the different groups, communicating between the different ones. One of the things the general superintendent oversaw was the chief of the railroad police. So we have not very much documentation on the railroad police, but a little bit we do deals in the general superintendent's files communications with them.
Well, that brings up an interesting point about there's a, I don't know if it's exclusively the C series, but there's a series of photographs that are called crooks.
Yeah.
And I'm always curious, these are obviously, well, they're crooks, but I mean, they're criminals or people who have done something stolen from the railroad. What do we have any sense of what that?
Well, they're
photograph says?
with the photographic collections. There is one little series, one group of pictures of basically there's something called BOLs in law enforcement term. Be on the lookout. And I think that a lot of these photos were photos on be on the lookout for so and so, and they had the negatives, and they're a little bit into processing film and stuff, and they integrated it into their regular law enforcement. But but they ultimately gathered up a number of photos. If you look at the photos, some of them are basically like with the number and everything in different positions, and some of them have recordings of what their head size was or something else to determine who they were. But no, they're just one little piece of history there, which I assume that's why they got saved.
Okay. So these weren't people that necessarily ever would have been seen on the Lackawanna, but they were on the lookout for them. So like a wanted list, or
kind of a wanted list, or just document who they were. Some of them looked like they got beaten up pretty bad before they had their picture taken.
And who would have taken? It would have been.
They probably would have brought in the railroad photographer who was doing the regular stuff for
So
them.
Bunnell or somebody?
It could have been Bunnell or anybody.
Really?
Or maybe the police had a photo. I don't know. But it's kind of interesting because the whole section of boxes marked for this set was just crooks. And there was no additional documentation to go along with it.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. One thing we ran into during the Great Depression, they were trying to find hobos, and they said, well, how many do you want us to find? We can give you as many as you want, because they knew where they were, and they pretty much had it documented.
Well, hobos would ride the railroad, on a regular basis.
Yeah.
And I imagine that was one of the things that kept the railroad police busy, was trying to kick them off of trains and such, one would think.
Yeah. I mean, there is they kept people out of the yard. Even the Scranton yard, people like Chuck Yunker would talk about how he was a kid and how the people that worked in the signal towers almost adopted him and let him take pictures, but he was saying that other places you wouldn't be able to get to this area because the railroad police would get you. And much of this yard would have been you wouldn't be able to get onto.
Which is interesting because after 9/11, there was I'll say a very heavy crackdown in terms all over, but especially, let's say, in the railroads around New York, concerning about terrorism and so forth. I know many. I'm not passing any judgment on this, but many people were surprised at the level of security, and people even want to take photographs of trains for a while. It was not only discouraged, but it was, I guess, almost prohibited. And it sounds like a lot of that, it was like almost like a throwback to a previous time when there was a much, let's say, more vigilance in terms of protecting the property of the railroad. Maybe for slightly different reasons, but there is history there, where the railroad could be very, very
Protective.
protective. Yes, thank you. I was looking in the strong arm, but protective of its property.
Yeah, and when World War I happened, in our files, in the general superintendent's files, they document how they tried to secure the railroad. You know, it was the only time in U.S. history that the railroads were ever nationalized, but they basically still ran the railroads. The railroad companies did. They just had a hierarchy where they had to answer to somebody in Washington. But it was real interesting looking at what, after the war was declared and they were all worried about sabotage and everything, and they had put National Guard units on every bridge, and they actually had them parading around here on this yard. They had National Guard units keeping an eye on stuff. And after a couple months, they finally figured out the National Guard units were doing more damage than not having the National Guards, and it wasn't the sabotage they thought was going to happen when the war was declared.
Yeah, because there are rumors, this may be fact as a matter of fact, but I thought that there was, that they would post sentries like on the viaducts, and just for that very reason, for the fear of sabotage occurring. Although the viaducts are all such that you would need to have like something the size of a Hiroshima bomb probably to take them down.
Yeah. But they had reports of the National Guard units and the Army units going out drinking in town and then having target practice on the insulators on the telegraph and electrical lines going through the area.
Okay. So.
I mean, there was probably more sabotage accidental just out of pure boredom. And there was another instance where they had a National Guard unit watching a bridge, and they let people on the bridge that weren't supposed to go on the bridge, but then the people that had to go on to fix the bridge, they wouldn't let them on. So there's documentation of that. It was just a little bit crazy. It's kind of funny. And then the other thing with the police, it was just really interesting with the general superintendent's records, are the Rule G violations. Drunk engineers, people drinking on the job. They really cracked down on that. And they had, again, we have some of the railroad police reports where they were just told to follow people after they got off work and follow them to the bars and document how much they drank, because they all had signed things saying that they would not drink alcohol. And then hearing some of the excuses got kind of interesting. So we have that in there as well, the person aspect of railroading. There was one instance, I have the letter in my desk, I probably shouldn't have it in my desk, but a little 7-year-old girl wrote the general superintendent of the railroad and asked for her daddy to get his job back, because she was going to not be able to take piano classes anymore.
And presumably he was fired because of...
because he was drinking. But the general superintendent, E.M. Ryan, he's asked the head law enforcement guy, he says, well, can you tell me if this guy is really a good worker, or was he just a drunk or what? And they basically said, no, he's a good worker, and they hired him back. And the only other place I can find reference to the guy is like 20 years later when he retired from railroad service.
Wow.
So there's lots of interesting stories in there.
Yeah, there's one story talking about alcohol consumption in one of the accidents, which was where the engineer had been drinking, and they had documentation to that effect. And President Truesdale took a personal interest in it and was following. The Lackawanna never, I could say, probably was never satisfied with what happened. Because I guess of the egregious nature of the accident. I can't remember which accident it was, but it would have to have been, let's say, prior to 1916, because obviously Truesdale's records end at that point. But you would find that and that's the interesting thing about Truesdale as a president, where you can't really compare him so much with his successors like Davis or White or Shoemaker, because we don't have that information. But he was very, almost like, I'll say, he watched things very closely, I guess I would put it that way. He was a micromanager, I guess, in many ways, at least that's what you would call it today, I think. But but the records reflect that he got involved in many different details that you would expect that a president of a fairly large railroad would not be involved with.
Yeah, but he was definitely involved in consumption of alcohol on his line, and there were times people begged him to rehire somebody, and he would come back and say, this, what had happened, and he would cite similar types of drunks that caused accidents, and says, would you want this to happen to you? So he was really and the thing is, basically Truesdale is trying to make his railroad one of the most efficient railroads in the world, and having drunk people at work just did not fit that.
Now, in some of our previous discussions, not within this video, but in previous discussions, we've talked about how even though we can focus on individual aspects of the railroad, it's really the bigger story is looking at everything sort of in a broader view. For example, just a few years ago, I'll mention about the Tunkhannock Viaduct. Its centennial celebration. I guess that would have been 2016 or 2015.
2015.
2015. But that it was to some degree overlooked that this was that bridge was part of a bigger project. The Clark Summit Holstead cutoff project. But the reason why that was built was to enable the railroad to be more efficient. That there weren't these projects were done. Anything that the railroad did was thinking about the bottom line. I mean, ultimately, we kind of nowadays kind of scoff. It's like, oh, they're thinking about the bottom line. That's all they think about. Well, that's the profit is if you're as you know, if it's your private corporation, profit is an extremely important thing. Yeah. Ultimately, that's what you're in business to make a profit.
Make money, yes.
And if you're not making a profit, you may not stay around very long. And of course, that's why the Lackawanna, the Erie Lackawanna, they don't exist anymore for that very reason. But is there sort of a greater story here that's being told, not even just in terms of the Lackawanna, the Erie, but in terms of railroading that Steamtown we're showing out there, not in here, but out there. But it's all together. It shows a picture of what railroads were, what they did, and trying to interpret that for the person today who may not even have much of any dealings with a railroad, other than maybe they ride a steam train here. But many people have never been on a train nowadays. It's quite a different world. And in Truesdale's time, I mean, the railroad was to I don't know if we can really think of any equivalent today. It would have been just as important as Amazon or any of the mega corporations that exist today.
Well, I had a kindergarten teacher or first grade teacher from New York City write me once, and she wanted to have a very simple first grade level type. This is how the railroads ran. And she asked me for a map of the United States and how many passenger railroads there were at the turn of the century, 1900. And basically what I found is the entire East Coast is black. For any small map, you get a really big map and show some stuff, but for the size of map she was looking for, the entire East Coast was black with all the passenger railroads that existed at the time. And she was like, well, can't you just show me the big ones? Or I said, well, this is it. And I said, maybe if I tried to show you a map of the major highways and thoroughfares at the time, major roadways, it might give you what you're looking for, but it was the only way you got from Scranton to New York City in 1900, or Model T or anything like that. Even 1910, even 1920s, it was rare to drive from New York to Scranton. You would take the railroad, would be the logical way of taking it. Yes.
Yeah, it's a completely different world that we would be dealing with if we're looking at railroading circa 1910 or 20, or it's to some extent unless you've studied it, it's almost impossible to comprehend what the railroads did. And it's interesting even to read articles about different parts of the U.S. being settled and evolving and growing up, and no one there. It's almost as if it's like no one talks about the railroads. It's almost like it's a given. But it's how many articles that I've read over the years, and it's sort of like it glosses over that contribution, how the United States was built by the railroads essentially, or at least it was expanded and connected by the railroads. And much of when we look at interstate highway maps, those interstate highways in many ways mirror between different points, point A, point B, point C, railroads that ran between those points. They almost like became, well, that's how they became competitive, because you had in many cases almost literally parallel routes, one roadway and various railroads. And certainly the Lackawanna was suffered as well as time went on, and the Erie Lackawanna as well, because of competition from other forms of transport. And that's a major story that occurs. Interestingly enough, that in Pennsylvania, when the original railroad between Clark's Summit and Halstead was abandoned for all intents and purposes, that it was given off to the highway department in Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
They never really, I guess, thought that, okay, this would be like giving your competition, exactly what it needed, as opposed to you would think it would have tried to have avoided that.
Yeah.
But maybe that was never something that they even considered to be a threat 100 years ago.
Yeah, or they were always looking on how to make money. When they did start getting bus competition, they actually encouraged it in some places, so they'd get rid of some of the other routes, some of the small, not efficient routes. But I mean, they're just in the records. You can map out everything. You can see where people are trying to create businesses, and the railroad's actually saying, "Oh, is this going to make money for us or not?" And they looked at everything.
Yeah, because one of the records I was looking through recently having to do once again with the Pennsylvania cutoff, and where they're basically looking at different alternative routes and factoring in the things that would give them a credit. In other words, they'd be able to scrap the old rail, they'd be able to sell off the right-of-way, that kind of thing. And you would think, and that's perhaps how they with the case of the old road in Pennsylvania, that they never thought in terms of the bigger picture. Okay, if we sell this off, yeah, we're getting it off our we're not paying taxes on it anymore, and that certainly saves us money. But the question is, have you also opened the door to something else occurring down the road? But maybe that was never really thought about. It's just a lot of things that when they were building the railroad in New Jersey, they had many complaints about, and this is reflective of the time. There were complaints from people in the area who during the winter had a horse and sleigh, and they have to go through these long tunnels, a so-called dry pull, and the people complained endlessly about that these tunnels prevented them or made it very difficult for their horses to pull this sled through hundreds of feet of dry, well, it basically wouldn't be pavement per se, but just dirt or whatever. But or that the tunnels were too narrow and that kind of thing. And to some extent, they're correct, because now, 100 years later, we're looking. It's a different world. But it's interesting to look back and think of what they were thinking when they were doing these projects, as to they wanted to make them last, but maybe didn't always expect what the implications of doing certain things would be way down the road. They didn't have that crystal ball that I guess we hoped that they might have had, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. It's but the one thing that our archives do provide is a viewer for all this. I mean, you can look at it, and you wouldn't even think about considering water supplies, There's all sorts of documentation on getting clean water and adequate water supplies, because really water was a fuel for the steam locomotives. If you didn't have adequate water, you couldn't run the steam locomotives. There's just so many different little things you can look at going into the railroad archives now. Now again, I've had people tell me, well, why do you even need to have those railroad archives? DL&W has Tabor's 3-volume set documenting the history of it. It's already been spelled out there. Why do we need the archives? Why do we need to preserve this? There's always different angles to look at history, so there's always some revisionism going on how history is interpreted.
And with all due respect to Mr. Tabor and the wonderful work he did with well, it was actually 2 Tabors, but that they did collectively in putting together those 3 volumes, the whole story isn't there. There's more that they could not put there, and which they didn't even have necessarily available to them. But from a practical perspective, they could not incorporate, nor did they have access to all that you have now, and that there is more that can be found if you're interested in looking. It depends, may not. For many people, what's in Tabor is sufficient, but there's more to the story than just that. So speaking of the archives, well, I'm wondering if we possibly could actually take a look and see when we talk about the archives, what is actually there physically, and get a sort of, I'll say, a cook's tour of the operation. It reminds me a little bit of the ending scene in the Raiders of the Lost Ark. I like to make that comparison, but it's a fairly large facility you have.
Yeah, although I like to make the comparison with Raiders of the Lost Ark, the reason they put the Ark in this large archives, large storehouse, was to have it lost. The reason I put anything in my archives now is trying to process in such a way so it can be easily found. So,
good point.
While some people may think it's like Raiders of the Lost Ark, I hope it's different.
Well, I was thinking in terms of size, not necessarily organization, but yeah. Sure, okay, if we could, that would be great.
Sure. Okay, as I may have said before, this is our 3-dimensional storage room, mostly museum-type objects. Most of the archives are in the other room. Some of the larger devices and things are in the other room. But
so those are railroad shovels?
Yeah, railroad shovels. They're cataloged. Most of them, if you look closely, they're stamped for the particular railroad that had them. The railroads like marking their equipment, so when people took them, they'd often try and get it back.
DL&W shovel.
Yeah.
Huh. Okay.
So we have shovels, we have insulators, we have conductor uniforms, we have builder's plates, thousands of them. That's why we have a full-time curator here, and she is primarily focused on the 3-dimensional objects, while I focus on the paper and the documentary objects. Here's our primary archive room. Goes all the way back to where the exit sign is, so it fills in this entire area.
Can you fit anything more in here, or you are pretty much close to capacity?
Actually, if we ever get space saver type storage, we could actually consolidate to half or even a third of the room we're taking up right now. We could use it a lot more efficiently. And if we have it in a much more constricted room area, we could have climate control would be much easier than trying to do the climate of this entire area. So there's all sorts of different things we can do. But no, we definitely could do more efficient storage. But we have this here, well, we also have what I like to call our large format drawing room here. And And this contains the chief engineer files of the DL&W, the large format drawings. If you want the plans of this building, we have them in here. If you want the plans of the passenger station, we have them here. If you want the plans of the Hoboken station for the DL&W, we have them. If you want a standard railroad outhouse, we have the plans for that as well.
Or water closet, right? I've seen WC on.
WC on some of the plans. But we have, all of these cabinets are pretty much full.
Now the building we're in obviously is a Lackawanna building, or
It is a Lackawanna building, completed construction in 1910. So we have drawings of that. We have blueprints, we have vellum, we have paper. Some of the stuff is still rolled, partially because it's too big to fit in a standard map case, which is 3 feet by 4 feet. Some of the stuff's still rolled because it's just too delicate. We'd need a paper conservator to get the stuff flattened. But the one thing about what you see in this room, we have over 50,000 drawings, and 95% of them are scanned to some level. So I usually don't have to pull drawings out of this room. I can pull them up on my computer, and that saves a lot of work. But like I said, this entire room's filled with all sorts of different sizes, shapes, and types of drawings, which includes the New Jersey cutoff as well.
And some of these rolls I see, they must run, what, 50, 100, I mean, how many? Like this one here looks like something you would see in like a...
Or it could be multiple.
Oh, it could be multiple
there as well.
together.
But
Okay.
yeah, some of them are up to 60 feet long.
Oh.
So that's our large format drawing room, and again, primarily just DL&W from the chief engineer's office in Hoboken. We can see we do have some of the old file cabinets where some of the archives used to be stored at, so if we ever want to restore an office area, we have that capability. But a lot of the chief engineer files for the DL&W came out of those wood cabinets over there. And in the back, there's CNJ files.
Central Railroad, New Jersey.
Central Railroad, New Jersey, and then there's even a few Lehigh Valley cases. So a little bit of everything. But we don't use those to store documents anymore. We primarily use the acid-free boxes and stuff through here. So we do have general superintendent's files, chief engineer files.
Track car or whatever, what would this be? Sort of
That was a velocipede.
philosophy.
Velocipede. The DL&W definitely had these in operation. Some of our glass plate negatives show these, and have as many as 6 or 7 people loaded on one of these going down the track. A couple sitting on the bar there, a couple in the front, a couple in the back.
And somebody's doing like has to be a way of propulsion.
Yep.
Yeah.
It's more like a row machine in the gym.
Uh-huh.
And go like that. So, but it's just we have it stored here, sort of keep it out of the way so nobody's really damaging it. But it is a neat device. Although you wouldn't want to be on the tracks with a locomotive coming from the other direction. But again, we have DL&W records here, and I might have mentioned we have personnel records. This whole section here is just the personnel files for the DL&W that we have.
From roughly what year to what year?
Roughly 1890s to the 1950s.
Huh.
Again, there's about 5,000, and people say, oh, you should have one of my ancestors in there. But when you just say 5,000 people working for the DL&W, the DL&W existed for a century and a half. And they probably had over 1 million people work for the DL&W. So only 5,000 of those records are here. That's only a drop in the bucket. But every now and then we do get the matchup. We do get people asking about their relatives that worked for the railroad. So we have all that. Then we have additional files. Mostly the DL&W comes up to here, and then we have the Erie Railroad in this section. Then after the Erie Railroad, we have the Lehigh Valley. The next two sections are all Lehigh Valley records. Presidential files, chief engineer files mainly. So it tells us quite a bit about the Lehigh Valley. And then we have miscellaneous files down here dealing with minor railroads and other little subsidiaries, including the Nathan Manufacturing Company. So we got documentation that tells us how to build lubricators and steam whistles and that kind of stuff. And then, basically from here onward is what we got from Syracuse University. The DL&W and the Erie corporate records, as well as some other additional stuff. And that has yet to be processed. The stuff you see on the pallets came from the Williver collection.
John Wilbur. Yeah.
John Williver, that came from his house. And we still have yet to get the stuff straightened out and incorporated.
Now, what do you do when you receive duplicates? I mean, I don't know what John had.
Yeah, there's a lot of duplicates in there. We're just going to be processing it as a separate collection. We're not going to be culling anything unless there's a massive amount of duplicate material. I don't think there is. And
I know he printed or had printed a lot of photographs from the collection, because I know he went to Syracuse back when the collection was there,
Yeah.
and actually would order photographs to be taken. Back in the day, you could do that.
Yeah. So we have some of those, and there's some that, you know, with the glass plate collection, we have probably 90% of the original glass plates, but there's some that are missing. So we've been able to fill in some of those missing ones with Williver's collection and other things too.
Huh.
So you never know. But this is, like we had mentioned, the presidential outgoing correspondence is here. So you can see what we have. But you see all the stuff before this is the presidents before Truesdale. Truesdale starts up here, but there's a lot of other presidential correspondence and other presidential documentation here.
So like something, what, Sam Sloan, or is that?
Oh yes, ton of Sam Sloan stuff. Here's papers of Sam Sloan. More Sam Sloan. Oh, lots of Sam Sloan, but we also have Christopher Robert, John Brisbane, Drake Mills. So we have a number of different presidents at the railroad.
Oh, because those names are unfamiliar to me.
Yeah, going back to the 1850s.
Ah, okay.
So, very difficult to read. But again, we still have a lot of the original Syracuse labels, but the stuff is kind of separated. You can see how they processed it looking at their labels, but we have the Park Service labels also on these. And it basically is a parallel system. We didn't reinvent the wheel when we processed the Syracuse archives. They already had an organizational hierarchy we were able to build on.
Oh.
But ultimately we need to replace these because they're pretty acidic and they're over 60 years old now. They're old archive boxes. But this is like the finance section for the railroad. And all these need to be semi-processed. Then we have some of the large ledgers you see through here, which basically says what they spent money on and how they spent it. And even more ledgers. Stock ledgers. And you need somebody like like an accountant to really figure it out. because you don't see these kind of ledgers anymore. And well, you can see on the labels what they actually do, because right now we're dealing with the operating department and the different accounts that the operating departments had. And then this is where you get to the glass plate negative collection, where I say there's 20,000 of them. This entire row on this side and about 1/3 of the row on this side is from our glass plate negative collection. Which is kind of interesting. We like to store them sitting on end because glass plate negatives are kind of like tiles. If you ever stack a bunch of tiles on top of each other, the very bottom one cracks just because of the weight. But if you put them up like a library book, and that's how these are stored right now, that keeps them from cracking. So, something we learned over the years.
And in terms of deterioration, is there any sense that you have in terms of how long these will continue to exist? I mean, because in 100 years, some of them look pretty good, some of them better.
Yeah,
than
some of
others.
them look pretty good. Some of them had water exposed to them. Some of them didn't. I'm just figuring that they're going to be relatively slow deterioration. But again, they are all scanned at least to one level right now. Not as high as some people would like, but we can pretty much reproduce almost any of the images here.
Now, later on, at some point, does the Lackawanna photographers use what are called regular negative film?
Yeah, they did gradually. And actually on some of these you can see some of the X, which goes into the 30s, where they did start going with acetate. Cellulose acetate film as opposed to glass plate.
And do the glass plates last longer, do you think?
The glass plates apparently last longer. A lot of the problems we have is with the more recently taken ones on acetate film. When it gets hot, they have a tendency of sticking together and causing problems. We had some where they were just a big hunk of plastic basically because it deteriorated, it got wet, moldy, and we lost probably 50 images. So the glass plates seem to be much, much better in surviving. Actually, a lot of the acetate type film we'll put in the freezer, but you don't for preservation purposes. The standard safety film or even the nitrate negative film you'd like to store in a freezer, but the glass plates you don't. They can stand better even in the current environment. And just to see some of the glass plates that we have. They took pictures of just about everything. They even took pictures of pictures sometimes. And like one of the classic pictures they took was the one showing all 4 of the viaducts for the DL&W Railroad.
Comparison?
Yeah, they sort of have, it shows up in Tabor's book. I don't know if you can see that.
See through it? You can sort of.
Yeah. But it shows the 4 main viaducts and how they compare in size.
And do we have a number on that? Because we can dig out the...
Yeah, so it's F180.
Okay. So
See if it shows any better from that side. But
we can dig out F180
yeah.
from digital image. And I believe Tabor uses something very similar in his book.
He uses something exactly like that in his books,
Yeah.
although he never refers to the negative number, and he usually crops them off in how they present it in that book, so it's like his own personal set. But
This is...
yeah, this you can see a little bit better.
I wonder if you've got it, held it up to light and then got... yeah.
Yeah, This is one of their 8 by 22 inch ones. So this is what they use for panoramic shots. So that's the one they did a lot on the viaducts.
What's the number on that one? You have it.
This one is L18.
Okay. So their camera had to be that much larger or
Yeah,
wider?
the back of the camera
Oh.
had to be that big. So a little bit of everything. You
So
got.
Bunnell and Barry had to carry around this trove of glass negatives that were unexposed?
Unexposed, yeah. And they, even after they exposed them, they used those boxes to store them in, and we still have hundreds of negative boxes because we have them in better storage now. But when we first got the stuff from Syracuse, they were still in the original boxes that used to hold them before they were unexposed.
Now they didn't have like a when he was doing the exposure, there had to be a way to obviously expose the glass negative, but also stop the exposure.
Yeah.
And then protect it until it could be developed.
Yeah.
presumably.
So they probably had a cover and all sorts of. I'm not a
Yeah,
photographer, but yeah, there was a whole process to it, and that's why they had professional photographers taking those pictures because it wasn't just a simple point and shoot cameras at that time. I mean, even people that can remember the 35 millimeter where you have to feed it into the camera in a dark room, most people don't even remember that anymore.
Yeah.
So, but we have more of the documentation here. Here's one of the examples of the Truesdale correspondence. So this is one of the ledgers for that.
Now this is literally a carbon copy.
I don't think it was even a carbon copy. They had some copying process that I don't understand how they did the blue. And sometimes you can see where it's actually something wasn't right and it faded or it just like ran down the side of the paper. It wasn't, I'm not sure what the copying process was on this.
But presumably it was something, it was not obviously long before Xerox that you would think it was some physical way that when the typewriter,
Well, it made a carbon copy because they'd have the original on the top with the letterhead. None of these have letterhead.
Okay.
So it takes the carbon copy underneath and does this reproduction.
Curious whatever happened to the originals. I mean, they just,
The originals went out in correspondence.
Oh, so they went
So
to-
we might actually be able to match up some of Truesdale's outgoing correspondence with the general superintendent's files who received a letter from Truesdale. But that would be with a full letterhead on it.
oh, okay.
This is only the outgoing, which is neat for transcribers because all it is straight text. When you start throwing things in with pictures and indents and other fancy stuff, it makes the transcription a lot more difficult. And this is just good, clean, straight transcription and easily searched. At least that's what I say.
Okay.
But also, after the glass plate negatives is where we hit the additional corporate subsidiaries of the DL&W. So this entire area here is all the different subsidiaries. And I pulled a couple of them out. Here's one of the boxes dealing with the Warren Railroad from 1854.
John I. Blair.
Yeah, and we got Liggett's Gap Railroad, 1849 to 1853. Just the general, I'm trying to remember what's here. Yeah, corporate minute book for the period.
Now Liggett's Gap, is that considered like the Scranton area? Or what is that?
Liggett's Gap is actually the basically heading up towards Chinchilla.
Chinchilla.
Yeah, that's Liggett's Creek there. So Liggett's Gap Railroad was going up through there. So that was part of the original DL&W. And then here is Delaware and Cobb's Gap Railroad, corporate minute book. Recently we had somebody who was descendant of Cobb, named after the Cobb Railroad. And he found it interesting that we had the corporate minutes for that. So a little bit of everything here, you know. It's hard to say, you know, what's additionally buried here. We have the stuff down to the box level, but not down to the individual folder level, so who knows what corporate stuff we have here that may tie in with other searches. I mean, we know what we have, we can pull this stuff box by box, but it's matching up your individual concerns is a little more difficult. And somebody coming up to me and saying, oh, I'm looking for information on this, you go pull this stuff that's pertinent to my search. It's not always easy. But so DL&W subsidiaries, a little bit of Erie Railroad records over here. The stuff on the wall is unprocessed. I still need to get work on that. Then we have Erie subsidiaries. And last but not least, we have one large collection from the Lackawanna and Wyoming Valley Railroad, the Laurel Line. That was processed, this stuff over here, as a separate collection, but the Laurel Line was actually owned by the DL&W during, you know, the end of it. So they had the corporate record of the Laurel Line as well.
That was electrified?
That was, yeah, electrified. That was basically a trolley. They had where the University of Scranton has their athletic fields and parking area, that was the main turnaround point for the Laurel Line. So, but a little bit of everything.
Wow. So that's the Steamtown archives?
Pretty much. I mean, you can see some of the stuff still waiting to get processed and trying to get the stuff in boxes, in wrappers, a basic documentation level saying what's here and going from there. One little bit we have, I tried to call these an archive once, but I mentioned that we had stuff for the Nathan Manufacturing Company that made lubricators and whistles and stuff for steam locomotives. Well, we have the paper archives, but we also have the three-dimensional molds and dies and tools that go into making a steam pieces for a steam locomotive. So you can see we have different types of molds, different kinds of drills, reamers. I'm not a person that works with this kind of stuff. People go crazy sometimes when they see this. And we've actually had inquiries from as far away as Australia and New Zealand about Nathan devices. And someday, if we ever get this organized, we might be able to recreate some of those devices.
So where did all this stuff come from?
Well, like I said, when Steamtown USA started trying to put together their museum, they tried to collect their own archives, and they collected the Nathan paper stuff, but they also collected the patterns. So as Nathan Manufacturing Company was concluding business, Steamtown USA was at the right place at the right time, or maybe the wrong place at the right time if you're trying to figure out how to take care of this stuff now. But you know, there's a lot of American industrial history here, and there's so many different aspects you can take with the Nathan collection. Like in World War I, they were analyzing German technology to see what they could copy and steal from them. And they were actually, you know, correspondence going back and forth, documenting the different types of German lubricators and injectors and stuff. So, just a lot of industrial history.
And one of our models, I guess, was the Tunkhannock Viaduct that went to Germany just before the war and then disappeared, I guess?
Yeah. Like,
First World War, we're talking about.
First World War. Well, right after the Tunkhannock Viaduct was finished in 1915, but even before 1915, they had a 16-foot model of the Tunkhannock Creek Viaduct. The DL&W did, and to show off their great accomplishment in building that, they sent it to an industrial exposition in, I think, Leipzig, Germany, or Prussia. And they had sent it there, and then the war was declared, and they never found it. And we actually have in our correspondence, we have documentation where they're in German, where they're trying to figure out if anybody can find their wayward model. And it was never found. So there's all sorts of interesting ties.
And all sorts of stuff that I don't know that you could assemble a working model out of any of this, but I guess that's not your job. You know,
It's not my job, but if we can identify the pieces and match them up with what's in the archives, we could actually come up with parts and pieces. And who knows, with three-dimensional printing technology now, who knows how much information we could take from this and from our paperwork, and if we could actually manufacture a whistle or a lubricator or some part. Who knows? Pretty much the tour of our archives, but you can see it all here. I mean, every single one of these boxes had to be handled a dozen times to get it where it is now. Even the labels documenting what's inside of it had to be produced. Even the shelving that it's sitting on had to be put together here. So it's been pretty much a 20-year project for me.
and just so that anyone who sees the video doesn't think that they can just pop in and be let loose upstairs here. Obviously, well, you will allow, I guess, under restricted conditions, people to review the documents and such. You know, there's a process you'd have to go through in order to do that.
You've got to ask first, and when you do show up, you know, I need to know what you're looking for, and I can usually give you a listing, at least by box and sometimes folder level, of what we do have. Sometimes I actually have the entire folder scanned in, and you don't even need to come here. I can just drop it in an email and send it to you. You know, there is other stuff. If you identify a number of boxes that you want to look at, we'll bring them on downstairs into our library, and you can look at them in a nice controlled environment. Not only control for me watching you, but control with air conditioning and heating, because our conditions here aren't always the best. But feel free to contact, ask, and we can do searches on our database, and we can see if we might have some answer to your question. But as to letting somebody just come up here and peruse through the files, that's pretty much not done in any archival collection.
Nor would I expect it, but we didn't want to leave any lingering doubt that that was something that could be done, because we certainly appreciate the opportunity to come up here and take a look around. But with the understanding, this much of what's here is extremely fragile, and also, of course, it's you want it to be where it is, where you can find it also.
Yeah, and like I said, like with the large format drawings, a good deal of those are scanned in, so I rarely have to pull a drawing for somebody to look at anymore. And hopefully, as I get more and more stuff scanned in, I won't have to deal with the rest of this collection. And what really would be neat is if you could do a search and look at the different stuff and pull it up yourself and actually see it. So hopefully someday we'll have some kind of a good interactive program on the internet where you can search this collection yourself.
I would think that would be, I mean, that would be wonderful. I would imagine be, in terms of server space, probably take up quite a bit, but it would be something that would make this collection much more readily accessible.
Yeah, it would, and server space in the cloud and all these other fancy internet things is space doesn't cost nearly as much as it did 10 years, 20 years ago.
That's true.
20 years ago, we were talking a gigabyte as being one whole computer. Now you have thumb drives where you have hundreds of gigabytes on a simple thumb drive. And I could have this entire collection on a simple thumb drive or external drive easy enough.
Yeah, terabytes now are even cheap,
Yes.
relatively speaking, so, yeah. So, well, once again, thank you very much for the tour. There was really, obviously quite a bit here, and we only scratched the surface. You kept at a very high level, but it's remarkable how much has been actually preserved and is accessible, and even maybe even readily accessible, because if you've already scanned it, you don't have to come up here and start opening up boxes and such.
Yeah. So, and the stories to be told here, we haven't scratched the surface on them yet.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thank you.
Well, thank you.
So, here we are. We're going to be leaving Steamtown. I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Pat McKnight, where we talked about a different aspect of the operation at Steamtown, but a very important one, very important from our perspective because of the history and the records that are associated not only with the Lackawanna Cutoff, but with the Lackawanna Railroad. As we learned, several other railroads will also have their records that are stored here. So, hope you've enjoyed part 24 on the Lackawanna Cutoff, and that you look forward to part 25.